Hey guys, medieval childbirth is often imagined as dangerous simply because medicine was primitive, but the truth is more unsettling than that. The danger did not come from one single thing. It came from a whole world of weak nutrition, hard labor, religious fear, household pressure, limited anatomy, and a medical culture that sometimes helped, sometimes comforted, and sometimes stood helplessly at the edge of life and death. Tell me where you're watching from, and what quiet corner of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support the channel. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, curious, and quietly fascinating history stories like this one. So tonight, we begin not with a battlefield, a king, or a plague ship, but with a small room in a medieval house, where one of the most ordinary human events could become one of the most frightening moments of a woman's life. To understand medieval childbirth, we have to step away from the modern hospital, from clean sheets, from emergency surgery, from blood transfusions, from antibiotics, and from the quiet confidence that someone nearby understands exactly what is happening inside the body. In the medieval world, birth was not treated as a medical appointment in the way many people would recognize today. It was a household event, a female event, a spiritual event, a family crisis, and sometimes a community drama. It carried hope, because children meant inheritance, labor, continuity, and salvation for the family line. But it also carried fear, because everyone knew someone who had died in childbirth, or lost a child before baptism, or survived a delivery only to fade days later from fever. That is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand. Medieval people were not careless about childbirth. They did not think death was normal in the sense of being unimportant. They feared it deeply. They prayed against it. They prepared for it. They surrounded the pregnant woman with customs, midwives, charms, saints, warm cloths, whispered advice, and practical experience passed from woman to woman. But they lived inside limits that no amount of care could easily overcome. A difficult labor could become deadly because the pelvis was too narrow, because the baby was badly positioned, because bleeding would not stop, because infection had already entered the body, or because help arrived with knowledge but without the tools to reverse what was happening. In a medieval village, pregnancy was rarely a private condition. Bodies were part of family economies, and a woman's fertility mattered not only to her husband, but to parents, in-laws, landlords, heirs, and sometimes entire households. A peasant woman might continue working through much of pregnancy, carrying water, tending animals, kneading bread, gathering fuel, washing linen, and helping in the fields when needed. Noble women had servants, better food, and softer beds, but even they were under intense pressure. For them, childbirth was tied to dynasty. A healthy son could secure a marriage alliance or stabilize an estate. A failed pregnancy could become a political problem. So while class changed the surroundings, it did not remove the danger. In some ways, it only changed the shape of the fear. The medieval pregnant body was also shaped by conditions long before labor began. Many girls and women entered pregnancy after years of inconsistent nutrition. In good seasons there might be bread, ale, beans, pottage, cheese, onions, and occasional meat or fish. In hard seasons, there might be hunger, poor grain, thin gruel, and bodies already weakened by work. Childhood illness could affect growth. Repeated pregnancies could drain strength. A young bride might become pregnant before her body had fully matured. An older mother might face risks after many deliveries. None of this required anyone to be cruel or ignorant. It was simply the pressure of a world where food, labor, marriage, and survival were tied together. And then there was the room itself. When labor began, men were usually pushed out of the birthing chamber, at least in ordinary circumstances. Childbirth belonged to women. The midwife, female relatives, neighbors, and experienced mothers gathered around. The space might be warmed if fuel was available. Windows could be covered to block drafts. Cloths would be prepared. Water might be heated. Herbs might be brought in. A birthing stool could be used, or the woman might squat, kneel, sit, lean, or lie depending on local habit and the advice of those assisting her. The modern image of birth as something managed by a male physician is largely the wrong image for much of the Middle Ages. In most cases, the central authority in the room was the midwife. The medieval midwife has often been treated unfairly in popular imagination, either as a superstitious old woman muttering charms, or as a secret folk expert who knew everything modern doctors forgot. The truth is more interesting. She was usually practical, experienced, and socially important. She had seen births before. She knew how to read signs, how to encourage, how to position a woman, how to wash and wrap a newborn, how to call for spiritual help when the danger deepened. She might know herbs, oils, compresses, and techniques passed down through generations. But she did not possess modern obstetrics. She could not perform safe abdominal surgery. She could not give antibiotics. She could not transfuse blood. She could recognize disaster, but recognition was not the same as rescue. This is where the quiet terror of medieval childbirth begins to appear. The people in the room might know that something was wrong, but knowing did not guarantee that anything could be done. A prolonged labor might stretch through day and night while candles burned down and women took turns supporting the mother. A baby might be stuck. The mother might become exhausted. Her pulse might weaken. The room that had begun with low voices and preparation might slowly change into a place of prayer. Religion was not an ornament added to childbirth. It was woven through it. Medieval Christians understood childbirth through the story of Eve, through ideas about sin, suffering, salvation, and divine mercy. Pain in childbirth had a theological explanation, but that did not mean people accepted it coldly. They asked for protection. They invoked saints. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially associated with childbirth in many parts of medieval Europe. Prayers, relics, girdles, written charms, and sacred objects might be brought near the laboring woman. To modern eyes, this may look like superstition replacing medicine. But for medieval families, it was not so simple. Spiritual help was part of practical help, because the body and soul were not imagined as separate worlds. A woman in labor was vulnerable in both. She might die unconfessed. A baby might die unbaptized. That fear was immense. The fate of an infant soul mattered deeply in medieval Christian society. Because of this, midwives were sometimes authorized to perform emergency baptism if the newborn was in danger and no priest could arrive in time. This tells us something important about their status. They were not merely household helpers. They stood at the border between life and death, body and soul, family and church. Their hands might be the first to touch the child, and in a crisis, their words might carry eternal significance. Yet the most frightening dangers were often the least dramatic at first. A birth could appear successful, the baby crying, the mother alive, the room relieved. Then, over the next days, fever could come. The skin could heat. Pain could spread. A foul smell might be noticed. The woman might become confused, weak, or unable to rise. Before germ theory, infection was poorly understood. People had ideas about bad air, corrupted fluids, imbalance, divine punishment, and bodily disorder. Some advice was useful by accident. Some was harmless. Some could worsen the situation. But without knowledge of bacteria, sterile technique, or effective antimicrobial treatment, postpartum infection could turn a survived childbirth into a delayed death sentence. Bleeding was another danger that terrified families. Heavy blood loss after delivery could kill quickly. Today, postpartum hemorrhage is still treated as an emergency even with modern medicine. In the medieval period, The available responses were limited: pressure, binding, herbal preparations, prayer, and experience. Some women survived because bleeding slowed on its own. Others did not. And because medieval records are uneven, often written by clerics, officials, or aristocratic households, the death of a peasant woman might leave no name behind at all. She might vanish into a burial entry, a memory, or no document whatsoever. This lack of records can make medieval childbirth feel distant. But the danger was not abstract to the people who lived with it. It shaped how families planned, how women prepared, how communities responded, and how pregnancy was spoken about. There were customs of confinement before birth, especially among wealthier women, where the mother withdrew into a controlled domestic space. Among elites, the chamber might be darkened, warmed, and arranged with hangings and religious images. The point was not only comfort. It was protection, separation, and preparation for a dangerous threshold. Birth was not treated lightly because everyone understood that the woman was crossing into a place from which not all returned. There is also a cruel contradiction here. Medieval society depended on childbirth, celebrated fertility, and placed immense value on motherhood. Yet the women who carried that burden often had little control over the conditions that made birth dangerous. Marriage could be arranged young. Pregnancies could follow one another. A woman's value in her household could be tied to producing heirs. Abstinence, contraception, and reproductive choice existed in various forms and moral debates, but they were constrained by religion, law, custom, and power. For many women, childbirth was not a single risk taken once. It was a recurring danger across years of adult life. And still, it would be wrong to imagine every birth as a scene of panic. Many births ended in relief. Many women survived multiple pregnancies. Midwives delivered countless children successfully. Communities had knowledge that worked well enough much of the time. Mothers nursed, recovered, returned to work, and raised families. The danger was real, but it existed alongside ordinary continuity. This is part of what makes the subject so human. Medieval childbirth was not simply horror. It was hope under pressure. It was routine surrounded by fear. It was one of the most common experiences in society, and yet each time it opened the possibility of catastrophe. The physical experience of labor itself was also shaped by medieval ideas of the body. Learned medicine in Europe drew heavily on ancient Greek and Roman authorities, especially Galen and Hippocrates, as interpreted through Arabic and Latin traditions. The body was often understood through humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, balanced with qualities such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. Women's bodies were commonly described as colder and wetter than men's, and menstruation, pregnancy, and birth were interpreted through these frameworks. Such ideas may sound strange now, but they offered medieval physicians a system for explaining symptoms and treatments. The problem was not that medieval people lacked intelligence. It was that their explanatory system did not give them access to the biological mechanisms that mattered most in childbirth emergencies. Male physicians, when involved, were often more likely to appear in elite contexts or difficult cases. But childbirth remained an area where women's practical knowledge dominated. There was tension between learned medicine and female practice, but also overlap. A midwife might use practical techniques that no university-trained physician had personally performed. A physician might provide advice based on theory and texts. Surgeons, barber surgeons, and other practitioners might be called when a delivery had gone terribly wrong. But many interventions were desperate. Tools that could remove a dead fetus might save the mother in some cases, but the procedures were traumatic and dangerous. Caesarean delivery, as a way to save both mother and child, was not a reliable medieval option. In most cases, it was associated with a mother already dead or dying. That detail is worth pausing over, because it reveals how different the medieval horizon of possibility was. Today, a dangerous obstructed labor may become a surgical emergency with a strong chance of survival. In the medieval world, obstruction could slowly become a trap. Time itself became dangerous. The longer labor continued, the more exhausted the mother became, the more likely infection, injury, or death became. Those in the room might shift from encouragement to concern, from concern to pleading, from pleading to last rites. And here we find one of the deepest emotional differences between medieval and modern childbirth. Modern medical systems are built around intervention. The assumption is that when danger appears, action escalates. Medieval families did act, but their actions existed inside a narrower world. They could change the mother's position. They could give drinks, herbs, or broths. They could warm the room. They could massage, support, pray, fetch a priest, call another midwife, or seek a practitioner. But many of the decisive tools were missing. The line between waiting and helplessness was painfully thin. For poorer women, another difficulty was privacy. A medieval house might be small, crowded, smoky, and shared with children, relatives, servants, animals, or stored goods. The birthing space could be made separate, but separation was relative. Sounds traveled. Smells lingered. Firewood cost labor. Clean linen was valuable. Water had to be carried. Light came from candles, rushlights, hearth glow, or daylight. In such a world, cleanliness did not mean what it means now, not because people enjoyed filth, but because material conditions made cleanliness hard. Linen had to be washed by hand. Water was heavy. Soap existed, but access varied. Floors, bedding, and hands could all carry invisible dangers no one yet understood. Among wealthier households, the chamber could be more controlled, but even luxury had limits. A noblewoman might have better bedding, more attendants, finer linen, warming pans, food, wine, spices, and religious objects. She might also have more pressure on the outcome. The birth of an heir could be watched indirectly by a household waiting outside. News might travel quickly. The mother's body became a political site. If she delivered a son, bells might ring in the imagination of the family. If she delivered a daughter, reactions varied depending on inheritance needs and local customs. If she died, remarriage, guardianship, property, and succession could all shift. So medieval childbirth was dangerous in two ways at once. It was biologically dangerous because pregnancy and delivery placed enormous stress on the body without modern medical backup. And it was socially dangerous because the outcome could alter a woman's standing, a child's future, a marriage, or an estate. This social pressure did not cause hemorrhage or infection, but it shaped the emotional atmosphere around every contraction. The unborn child, too, lived in a world of uncertainty. Medieval infant mortality was high. Many babies died in the first days, weeks, or years of life. A successful delivery did not guarantee survival. Baptism, therefore, carried urgency. Naming, godparents, churching, swaddling, nursing, and household care all belonged to a fragile chain of survival. A newborn might be wrapped tightly in swaddling bands, partly from custom and partly from beliefs about shaping and supporting the body. Breastfeeding might be done by the mother, or among elites sometimes by a wet nurse. Each choice reflected class, health, custom, and social expectation. For the mother, recovery was not simply physical. In Christian communities, the ritual known as churching marked a woman's return to church after childbirth. Its meaning could vary, and historians debate how women experienced it, whether as purification, thanksgiving, reintegration, or a mixture of all these. But it reminds us that childbirth changed a woman's status for a time. She had passed through blood, danger, and seclusion. Her return was noticed, and now the deeper question begins to form. If childbirth was so dangerous, why did medieval society continue to organize women's lives around repeated pregnancy with such intensity? The answer is not merely that people wanted children. It is that children were woven into every layer of survival. They were workers in peasant households. They were heirs in noble lineages. They were spiritual beings to be baptized and raised within the faith. They were emotional bonds, economic necessities, and social expectations at once. In a world without pensions, modern state welfare, or reliable medical security, family was the structure that carried people through age, illness, labor, landholding, and memory. That does not make the suffering smaller. It makes the system clearer. Because once we see childbirth not as a single medical event, but as a point where food, work, religion, gender, inheritance, poverty, medicine, and fear all met in one room, the danger becomes much easier to understand. It was not just the absence of modern doctors. It was the presence of an entire medieval world pressing around the bed. And in that world, the person most responsible for guiding a woman through birth was often someone whose name history rarely preserved. The midwife, standing close enough to hear every change in breathing, old enough perhaps to have seen both survival and loss, trusted enough to enter the most private room in the household, and burdened with a task that could turn from ordinary to desperate in the space of a few quiet minutes. To understand her role more fully, we have to move closer to the birthing chamber itself, to the objects she used, the words she spoke, the rules she followed, and the strange mixture of practical skill and sacred responsibility that made medieval midwifery one of the most important and most overlooked forms of knowledge in everyday life. To understand her role more fully, we have to move closer to the birthing chamber itself, to the objects she used, the words she spoke, the rules she followed, and the strange mixture of practical skill and sacred responsibility that made medieval midwifery one of the most important and most overlooked forms of knowledge in everyday life. Unlike physicians educated in universities, most medieval midwives learned through observation, memory, and repeated experience. Their education rarely came from formal lectures or expensive manuscripts. Instead, it unfolded beside laboring women, often over decades, as older midwives quietly passed their knowledge to younger assistants. A difficult birth became a lesson. A successful delivery became another. Every household carried slightly different customs, yet across Europe there emerged a recognizable body of practical wisdom that depended less upon abstract theory than upon careful attention to the rhythms of the female body. This practical tradition deserves more respect than it has often received. Medieval midwives certainly lacked many scientific explanations that later centuries would develop, but they possessed something equally important within the limits of their world: pattern recognition. They knew that certain labors progressed steadily while others slowed unexpectedly. They noticed when contractions weakened instead of strengthening. They observed changes in breathing, skin color, bleeding, exhaustion, and consciousness. They watched the mother's face as carefully as her body, understanding that fear itself could shape the progress of labor. Although they could not measure blood pressure or monitor fetal heartbeats, they developed their own forms of careful observation. A woman who suddenly became unnaturally quiet after hours of labor might concern them as much as one crying loudly in pain. Silence sometimes signaled exhaustion beyond ordinary fatigue. Likewise, swelling, persistent bleeding, or prolonged inability to deliver the child all carried meanings that experienced attendants recognized, even if they could not fully explain the underlying physiology. One of the quiet misconceptions about medieval medicine is that everything depended on superstition. In reality, medieval childbirth often blended practical observation with religious belief so completely that separating the two becomes difficult. A midwife might encourage a mother to change position because experience suggested it sometimes helped. Moments later, she might recite a prayer to Saint Margaret or place a blessed object nearby. Neither action seemed contradictory to those involved. Physical effort and spiritual protection belonged together. This blending reflected a broader medieval understanding of the universe. Natural causes and divine providence were not seen as competing explanations. If a woman survived a dangerous labor, both the skill of those assisting her and the mercy of God could be credited without conflict. If tragedy occurred despite every effort, families often struggled not with whether practical measures had been taken, but with questions of divine purpose that modern secular societies frame quite differently. The birthing room itself was arranged with surprising intentionality. Fire was usually kept burning whenever fuel allowed, not merely for warmth but because maintaining a comfortable environment was considered important for the laboring mother. Clean linen, to the extent possible, would be gathered beforehand. Basins of warmed water stood nearby. Oils or animal fats might be prepared for massage or lubrication. Sharp knives were carefully placed aside for cutting the umbilical cord once the child had safely emerged. Some surviving household guides also recommend particular foods and drinks during labor. Warm ale, diluted wine, broths, honey mixtures, or herbal infusions appear in different regional traditions. Modern medicine would not necessarily endorse many of these remedies, yet their purpose often makes practical sense. Women undergoing many hours of labor required warmth, hydration, and energy, even if medieval people described those needs using different medical language. The birth stool itself deserves closer attention. Modern audiences often imagine women throughout history lying flat on beds during delivery because that image dominates contemporary hospital scenes. Yet, for much of medieval Europe, upright positions remained common. Birthing stools supported a seated posture that used gravity to assist delivery. Squatting, kneeling, or leaning against attendants were likewise familiar positions. These choices were not primitive alternatives awaiting improvement. In fact, many modern obstetric specialists recognize advantages to upright labor positions under appropriate circumstances. Here is one of those quiet reversals that history often offers. A practice that appears old-fashioned sometimes reflects practical reasoning rediscovered centuries later. Not every woman, however, could use these positions comfortably. Long labors might force repeated changes. Exhaustion altered what was physically possible. Every birth developed its own rhythm, and experienced attendants adapted accordingly rather than following one rigid procedure. The emotional atmosphere inside the room also shifted continually. Early labor might include conversation, reassurance, even cautious optimism. Female relatives sometimes shared stories of their own deliveries to steady the mother's nerves. Familiar voices surrounded her. Hands offered support. Someone adjusted blankets. Someone else tended the fire. Another quietly prepared cloths for the child. As labor lengthened, however, conversation often became quieter. Practical instructions replaced ordinary talk. The midwife listened closely between contractions. Every pause seemed longer than the last. Family members who had entered confidently now watched each movement with increasing concern. Outside the room, husbands occupied an uncertain position. Popular imagination sometimes portrays medieval fathers as emotionally distant from childbirth, but surviving letters, legal records, wills, and religious writings suggest a more complicated reality. Most men simply lacked permission to enter the birthing chamber during normal deliveries. Their exclusion reflected social custom rather than indifference. Many husbands waited nearby, receiving occasional updates from female relatives. Some prayed in adjacent rooms. Others sought priests if labor became dangerous. Their inability to intervene often created its own quiet helplessness. They could provide resources, summon assistance, or prepare for whatever outcome followed. Yet the central struggle remained beyond their reach. Among noble households, this waiting sometimes became intensely political. Advisors, servants, family members, and household officials might gather discreetly beyond the chamber. Everyone understood that the outcome could determine inheritances, alliances, guardianships, or succession. Yet despite these enormous consequences, the decisive moments still unfolded inside a relatively small room where a handful of women carried the immediate responsibility. This contrast between immense political importance and intimate domestic reality runs throughout medieval history. Great dynasties depended upon events taking place in spaces that left almost no archaeological trace. The room itself vanished centuries ago. The voices disappeared. The fire burned out. Yet kingdoms occasionally changed course because of what happened within those ordinary walls. Pain management reveals another area where modern assumptions deserve careful examination. Medieval women were not simply expected to endure suffering without assistance. Various herbal preparations attempted to reduce discomfort or encourage labor. Some possessed mild physiological effects. Others probably offered little more than comfort through ritual. Warm compresses, massage, controlled breathing guided by experienced attendants, repositioning, and physical support all formed part of practical care. None of these approaches eliminated severe labor pain. That remained one of childbirth's defining realities. But neither were medieval women abandoned without compassion. Contemporary descriptions repeatedly emphasize encouragement, companionship, prayer, and continuous attendance. Pain was expected, yet relieving it as much as circumstances allowed was also considered an important responsibility. This distinction matters because it reminds us that compassion does not begin with modern medicine. Human concern for suffering is much older than antibiotics or anesthesia. What changes across history is not the desire to help, but the tools available. Complications involving the baby's position presented some of the greatest challenges. Modern imaging allows physicians to identify many problems before labor even begins. Medieval midwives possessed only their hands, their experience, and careful observation. A breech presentation where the baby's feet or buttocks emerged first dramatically increased risk. Likewise, shoulders presenting incorrectly or the baby's head failing to descend properly could transform an otherwise ordinary labor into an exhausting ordeal lasting many hours. Experienced midwives sometimes attempted manual repositioning. Such procedures demanded remarkable courage as well as practical skill. Without sterile gloves, pain medication, or precise anatomical knowledge, every attempt carried risk. Yet doing nothing also carried risk. Decisions unfolded under extraordinary uncertainty. One reason medieval childbirth appears so dangerous in retrospect is precisely because so many decisions had to be made with incomplete information. No one inside the room could see what was happening. They interpreted clues. They listened. They felt carefully. They judged probabilities rather than certainties. Sometimes those judgments proved astonishingly accurate. Other times they did not. The emotional burden upon experienced midwives must have been immense. Success brought gratitude, gifts, reputation, and renewed trust within the community. Failure could bring grief, self-doubt, suspicion, or even accusations, particularly if outcomes were repeatedly poor or unusual circumstances surrounded a birth. Fortunately, accusations of witchcraft against midwives during the medieval period have often been exaggerated by later popular culture. While isolated cases existed and became more common in certain early modern witch hunts centuries later, most medieval communities regarded competent midwives as valuable members of society rather than objects of automatic suspicion. Church authorities frequently regulated them precisely because their work mattered so greatly. In several regions, midwives swore formal oaths before ecclesiastical or civic authorities. These oaths reveal fascinating priorities. They promised to perform emergency baptisms correctly if necessary. They pledged not to use harmful magical practices. They agreed to report unusual births honestly. They committed themselves to assisting rich and poor alike whenever possible. These surviving documents reveal a profession already recognized as carrying significant ethical responsibility. Medieval communities understood that childbirth required trusted individuals whose judgment extended beyond technical assistance alone. Payment varied enormously. Wealthy households rewarded experienced midwives generously with money, clothing, food, or household goods. Poorer women might compensate through small gifts, future labor, or simple gratitude. Some midwives served entire villages for decades, becoming familiar with multiple generations of the same families. They delivered daughters who later became mothers themselves. Their knowledge accumulated not through textbooks but through hundreds of individual births remembered across a lifetime. That accumulation of memory formed an invisible archive far richer than most surviving written sources. Every difficult labor added another lesson. Every unusual presentation became another pattern stored away for future recognition. Long before evidence-based medicine adopted statistical thinking, experienced practitioners quietly developed practical judgment from repeated observation, even if they described it using very different concepts. Yet there remained situations where all accumulated wisdom reached its limits. Sometimes labor continued into a second day, then a third. The mother's strength steadily declined. Sleep became impossible. Food was difficult to swallow. Muscles that had worked continuously for hours began to fail. The unborn child, too, faced increasing danger. Inside the chamber, experienced women recognized that time itself had become an enemy. It was often at precisely this stage that difficult decisions began to emerge, whether another practitioner should be summoned, whether unfamiliar remedies should be attempted, whether extraordinary religious rituals should accompany practical efforts, and how families balanced fading hope against the painful recognition that both mother and child might soon stand at the edge of survival. Those decisions, shaped by medicine, faith, custom, and the emotional weight of everyone waiting both inside and beyond the chamber, would become some of the most difficult choices medieval families ever faced. And they reveal another layer of childbirth that is rarely explored when we speak only about mortality statistics rather than the lived experience behind them. Those decisions, shaped by medicine, faith, custom, and the emotional weight of everyone waiting both inside and beyond the chamber, would become some of the most difficult choices medieval families ever faced. And they reveal another layer of childbirth that is rarely explored when we speak only about mortality statistics rather than the lived experience behind them. When labor stretched beyond what experienced women considered ordinary, the atmosphere inside the chamber changed almost imperceptibly. There was rarely a single dramatic moment when everyone understood that danger had arrived. Instead, concern accumulated in small observations. The contractions no longer seemed to achieve anything. The mother's strength faded despite periods of rest. Her face grew pale beneath the candlelight. The pauses between waves of pain brought less relief than before. Conversations became quieter still, until only practical instructions and whispered prayers filled the room. At this point, the midwife's experience mattered as much for emotional guidance as for physical assistance. Panic helped no one. She had to project steadiness even when uncertainty weighed heavily upon her. Medieval writings occasionally describe midwives encouraging women with calm words, reminding them to breathe steadily, to conserve what strength remained, and to trust both their attendants and God. Such reassurance may sound modest, yet modern research into childbirth continues to recognize that fear, stress, and exhaustion influence labor in significant ways. The language has changed across the centuries, but the importance of calm companionship has not. If another practitioner was summoned, the journey itself consumed valuable time. Medieval roads varied enormously in quality. During winter, they might be buried beneath snow or transformed into deep mud. At night, travel depended upon lanterns, moonlight, or familiarity with local paths. In isolated villages, the nearest physician might live many miles away. Even a neighboring midwife with additional experience could require hours to reach the house. This delay shaped countless outcomes. Modern emergency medicine depends upon speed. Ambulances, operating theaters, blood banks, and trained surgical teams all exist because minutes matter. Medieval communities also understood that time mattered, but they possessed no comparable system for overcoming distance. Every messenger sent in search of help carried both hope and uncertainty. Sometimes the messenger returned with assistance. Sometimes the practitioner arrived too late. Sometimes no one could be found at all. This is another reason mortality in childbirth remained stubbornly high despite the sincere efforts of everyone involved. The knowledge available within one village might be excellent by local standards, yet serious complications demanded resources beyond what any isolated household could provide. Even among Europe's growing towns and cities, access to trained medical practitioners varied considerably. Urban centers offered larger populations of physicians, surgeons, and experienced midwives, but they also concentrated disease. Crowded neighborhoods, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and recurring outbreaks of infectious illness created their own hazards for pregnant women. A city could provide more expertise while simultaneously exposing mothers to greater environmental risks. Rural communities faced the opposite balance. Cleaner air, lower population density, and familiar local support networks offered certain advantages, yet specialized help remained scarce. There was no ideal location in which childbirth became truly safe. Different settings merely exchanged one set of dangers for another. One of the more fascinating aspects of medieval childbirth is the careful attention given to signs that modern observers might overlook entirely. Astrological timing occasionally influenced expectations, particularly among educated elites who consulted learned physicians. The positions of heavenly bodies were believed by many to affect health, temperament, and bodily processes. While astrology cannot predict childbirth outcomes in the modern scientific sense, it occupied a respected place within medieval natural philosophy rather than existing as a fringe belief. Physicians who studied at universities often considered celestial influences alongside anatomy, diet, and the balance of humors. At the same time, ordinary households relied less upon astronomical calculations than upon inherited customs. Certain saints' feast days inspired confidence. Particular prayers were copied onto small pieces of parchment and placed near the mother. Blessed candles burned beside the bed. Relics associated with motherhood or miraculous births might be borrowed from local churches whenever possible. These practices remind us that childbirth unfolded within an emotional landscape as much as a physical one. Hope itself required expression. In a world where many outcomes remained beyond human control, rituals offered families a sense that every possible avenue of protection had been explored. Not every ritual carried purely symbolic meaning. Some customs also served practical purposes while wrapped in religious language. Encouraging family members to remain present ensured the mother was never left unattended. Preparing clean cloths as part of ceremonial readiness also improved practical care. Maintaining warmth around the laboring woman aligned with both traditional medicine and simple physical comfort. This blending of symbolic and practical behavior appears repeatedly throughout medieval daily life. It would be misleading to separate them too sharply, because medieval people themselves rarely did. As labor continued, attention gradually shifted toward the unborn child. Without modern diagnostic tools, attendants relied upon movement, the mother's sensations, and the progress of delivery to judge whether the infant remained alive. Every hour without visible progress deepened anxiety. Infant mortality had already shaped medieval expectations long before labor began. Families knew from experience that pregnancy did not always produce a living child. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and deaths shortly after birth formed a painful part of ordinary life. This familiarity did not lessen grief. If anything, it heightened appreciation for every healthy birth that did occur. Naming customs reflected this fragile reality. Some children received names almost immediately after emergency baptism if survival seemed uncertain. Others entered family memory only briefly before disappearing from written records altogether. Medieval cemeteries contain countless infants whose lives lasted only days or even hours, silent reminders of how precarious early life remained. Yet amid these losses, remarkable resilience also characterized medieval families. Women who survived difficult deliveries often cared for households again within surprisingly short periods, not because recovery was complete, but because economic necessity rarely permitted prolonged rest. Fields required tending, bread needed baking, clothing required mending, animals demanded feeding. Noble women faced different responsibilities, but they too resumed household management, estate oversight, or courtly obligations sooner than modern medical advice would recommend. The postpartum period therefore carried dangers extending well beyond the delivery itself. Today, physicians monitor mothers for signs of hemorrhage, infection, blood clots, depression, and complications associated with healing. Medieval women experienced many of the same biological risks, but recognition and treatment remained limited. What appears to have been an uncomplicated birth could deteriorate several days later. Puerperal fever, now understood as a severe bacterial infection, represented one of the most feared possibilities, even though medieval people lacked any concept of microorganisms. A woman who seemed healthy immediately after childbirth might suddenly develop chills followed by intense fever. Her abdomen became painfully swollen. Weakness increased rapidly. Delirium sometimes followed. The tragic irony is difficult to ignore. The most dangerous moment occasionally arrived after everyone believed the crisis had passed. For families, this uncertainty prolonged emotional tension. Celebration remained cautious. Neighbors might congratulate the household while privately wondering whether the mother would still be alive the following week. Another misunderstood aspect of medieval childbirth concerns breastfeeding. Popular imagination often assumes that nursing came naturally to every mother. In reality, successful breastfeeding depended upon numerous factors including maternal health, nutrition, the infant's strength, and previous childbirth experience. If the mother died, another solution had to be found quickly. Wet nurses therefore occupied an important place within medieval society. Wealthy households sometimes employed them by choice, while poorer families sought them only in emergencies. In towns, networks occasionally developed through which women nursing their own children could also feed orphaned infants for payment. This arrangement carried its own emotional complexities. Medieval writers debated whether a wet nurse's character, diet, or temperament somehow influenced the child through her milk. Such beliefs reflected broader ideas about bodily substances and inherited qualities rather than scientific observation. Nevertheless, they shaped decisions among families able to choose between different nurses. For most ordinary women, however, breastfeeding remained the expected path whenever circumstances allowed. It provided nutrition, strengthened the bond between mother and infant, and, although medieval people did not fully understand the biological mechanism, often delayed the return of fertility for a period. This natural spacing between pregnancies offered some protection, though certainly not complete protection, against the physical strain of repeated childbirth. The rhythm of medieval family life therefore depended heavily upon the health of mothers in ways modern societies sometimes overlook. A mother's survival affected not only the newborn but older children, household labor, agricultural productivity, inheritance planning, and community stability. Her illness could ripple through an entire village economy. Legal records occasionally illuminate these consequences in unexpected ways. Property disputes, guardianship arrangements, remarriages, and inheritance documents often appear shortly after maternal deaths. Reading these records carefully reveals that childbirth altered not only family emotions but legal structures. A widow's children might come under different guardians. Land management shifted. Dowries returned to natal families under certain circumstances. Even the simplest farming household experienced practical upheaval when a mother died. This broader social impact explains why communities invested such trust in experienced midwives. They were not simply assisting one individual woman. They were helping preserve the continuity of families whose labor sustained villages generation after generation. As Europe entered the High Middle Ages, increasing urbanization slowly transformed aspects of medical practice. More written medical texts circulated in Latin and, gradually, in vernacular languages. Translations from Arabic scholars expanded European knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and obstetrics, although much remained theoretical. Universities produced learned physicians whose intellectual horizons widened considerably compared with earlier centuries. Yet an intriguing divide persisted. The university physician often understood childbirth primarily through books. The village midwife understood it primarily through hands-on experience. Neither perspective alone solved the greatest obstetric emergencies. Indeed, historians increasingly argue that practical female knowledge remained indispensable precisely because childbirth could not be mastered through theory alone. Delivering hundreds of babies taught lessons unavailable within manuscripts. Conversely, learned medicine sometimes offered broader frameworks unavailable through experience alone. This relationship was not always harmonious. Professional boundaries, social status, literacy, and gender all influenced how knowledge circulated. Yet reducing the story to conflict misses something essential. In many communities, learned physicians and experienced midwives complemented one another whenever circumstances permitted. Still, there remained conditions beyond either person's ability to overcome. One of the most heartbreaking involved obstructed labor caused by disproportion between the baby's head and the mother's pelvis. Such cases could continue for extraordinary lengths of time. Every passing hour increased exhaustion. Soft tissues became damaged by prolonged pressure. Infection became more likely. The child faced diminishing chances of survival. Modern obstetrics addresses this condition through surgical delivery. Medieval practitioners possessed no consistently safe equivalent. Faced with such circumstances, impossible choices emerged. If the child had already died, certain destructive procedures might be attempted in hopes of saving the mother's life. These operations were traumatic, physically devastating, and emotionally agonizing for everyone involved. Yet they reflected desperate efforts to preserve at least one life when both otherwise seemed certain to be lost. The existence of these procedures reminds us that medieval practitioners were not passive observers waiting helplessly for fate. They intervened whenever they believed intervention offered hope. The tragedy lay not in indifference but in limited possibilities. The emotional burden upon surviving mothers also deserves attention. A woman who lost an infant after days of exhausting labor carried physical injuries alongside grief. She might blame herself despite having no control over the outcome. Family members often struggled to comfort one another while simultaneously preparing funerals, managing household responsibilities, and confronting practical questions about future pregnancies. Remarkably, many women conceived again after such devastating experiences, not because the memory had faded, but because medieval life demanded continuity. Marriage, inheritance, economic survival, religious expectation, and personal hope all encouraged families to begin again despite profound loss. That resilience can seem almost unimaginable today, yet it formed one of the defining characteristics of medieval domestic life. Grief and ordinary routine frequently existed side by side. Fields still required harvesting. Bread still needed baking. Livestock still required care. The rhythms of survival allowed little opportunity for prolonged withdrawal. As we move deeper into this world, another question begins quietly to emerge. Beyond the physical dangers and practical realities of childbirth itself, what did medieval society actually believe pregnancy revealed about women, about the body, and about the mysterious process by which new life came into the world? Those beliefs would shape everything from medical advice to legal expectations, from religious teaching to family customs, opening yet another layer of understanding that lay just beyond the walls of the birthing chamber. Those beliefs would shape everything from medical advice to legal expectations, from religious teaching to family customs, opening yet another layer of understanding that lay just beyond the walls of the birthing chamber. To medieval people, pregnancy itself remained deeply mysterious. Today, biology describes fertilization, embryonic development, hormones, chromosomes, and fetal growth with remarkable precision. None of these explanations existed during the Middle Ages. Instead, people relied upon a combination of inherited classical medicine, Christian theology, careful observation, and centuries of accumulated practical experience. Their conclusions were often incomplete or mistaken by modern standards, but they were rarely arbitrary. They represented serious attempts to understand processes that remained invisible to the human eye. Most educated physicians inherited ideas from ancient authorities such as Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle, whose works reached medieval Europe through both Latin traditions and influential Arabic scholars. These texts offered complex theories about conception, fetal development, and the different roles played by men and women in creating new life. Although these theories frequently disagreed with one another, they shared a common limitation. No one could observe conception directly. Every explanation, therefore, depended upon reasoning from effects back toward unseen causes. This uncertainty produced vigorous debate. Some scholars argued that both parents contributed equally important substances to the unborn child. Others believed the father's contribution supplied the active principle while the mother's body provided nourishment and protection. Discussions extended into questions about inherited characteristics, personality, resemblance, and even moral disposition. Why did one child resemble a mother while another favored a father? Why were siblings so different despite sharing the same parents? Medieval medicine proposed answers that reflected the intellectual tools available at the time. What makes these discussions fascinating is not whether they were scientifically correct. It is the seriousness with which they were pursued. Learned physicians genuinely sought coherent explanations for life's beginnings, and their conclusions shaped practical advice given to pregnant women throughout Europe. One widespread belief held that a mother's emotional state could influence the developing child. Powerful fear, profound sadness, sudden shock, or overwhelming joy were thought capable of leaving marks upon the unborn infant. Modern medicine would reject many of these specific claims, yet they remind us how closely medieval society connected mind and body. Pregnancy was never viewed as a purely physical condition. Thoughts, emotions, diet, environment, and spiritual health all formed part of a single interconnected whole. As a result, families often tried to shield expectant mothers from severe distress whenever circumstances allowed. Noble women might temporarily withdraw from political tensions. Household disagreements could be softened in the presence of a pregnant wife. Certain frightening sights or distressing stories were considered best avoided. Whether these precautions altered fetal development in the ways medieval people imagined is another matter, but they demonstrate genuine concern for maternal well-being. Of course, such protection was easier for wealthy families than for poorer ones. A peasant woman could not simply withdraw from daily labor because pregnancy had advanced into its later months. Cows still required milking before dawn. Water still needed carrying from streams or communal wells. Grain had to be ground. Firewood had to be gathered before winter. Bread required kneading whether someone felt strong or exhausted. Seasonal rhythms often determined the physical demands placed upon pregnant women more than their own health did. Harvest provides one revealing example. During the brief weeks when crops ripened, every available pair of hands became valuable. Delaying harvest risked losing an entire year's food supply to weather. Consequently, pregnant women frequently continued working well into late pregnancy, not because communities lacked compassion, but because survival left little flexibility. The harvest could not wait until childbirth had safely passed. This reality introduces another quiet contradiction often overlooked in modern discussions. Medieval society celebrated motherhood while simultaneously depending upon the labor of pregnant women. These expectations existed side by side. The same community that prayed fervently for a safe delivery also relied upon expectant mothers to contribute to household survival until they physically could not continue. Nutrition added another layer of complexity. Advice literature frequently recommended wholesome foods for pregnant women. Fresh bread, eggs, milk, meat in moderation, fruits when available, and certain herbs all appear in surviving texts. Learned physicians recognized that nourishment mattered, even if they explained its effects through humoral theory rather than vitamins or proteins. The problem was not ignorance. The problem was access. Recommending nutritious food accomplished little during years of crop failure. Across medieval Europe, harvests fluctuated dramatically. Excessive rain, drought, early frost, warfare, animal disease, and locusts could all reduce food supplies. During difficult years, pregnant women ate whatever remained available to the household. Sometimes that meant adequate nourishment. Sometimes it did not. Modern studies have demonstrated how maternal nutrition influences fetal development, birth weight, and long-term health. Medieval families lacked those scientific explanations, yet they understood through observation that women weakened by hunger often experienced more difficult pregnancies. Their inability to prevent famine did not prevent them from recognizing its consequences. Pregnancy also intersected with another inescapable feature of medieval life: disease. Long before labor began, expectant mothers faced illnesses capable of weakening both themselves and their unborn children. Dysentery, influenza-like respiratory infections, malaria in certain regions, intestinal parasites, tuberculosis, smallpox, and countless other conditions circulated through medieval communities. Most infections had no effective treatment beyond supportive care. Recovery depended largely upon the body's own resilience. For pregnant women already carrying the physical demands of developing new life, illness could become especially dangerous. Dental health offers another surprisingly important example. Modern obstetrics recognizes links between severe gum disease and adverse pregnancy outcomes. Medieval people did not know this biological connection, yet tooth infections were widespread due to limited dental care. Chronic inflammation, nutritional deficiencies, and repeated infections likely placed additional burdens upon countless pregnancies without anyone recognizing the relationship. Such examples remind us that childbirth cannot be isolated from overall health. The danger began long before labor. It accumulated gradually across months and years. One woman entered pregnancy after a childhood of adequate nutrition, moderate workloads, and relatively good health. Another began carrying a child after surviving repeated winters of scarcity, chronic illness, hard agricultural labor, and previous difficult births. Although both experienced childbirth, they arrived at that moment with profoundly different reserves of physical strength. Medieval medicine certainly noticed these differences, even if it explained them differently from modern physiology. Physicians frequently described some women as naturally stronger, warmer, or more balanced in their humors than others. Their vocabulary differed, but they were often observing genuine variations in health. Age likewise influenced expectations. Very young mothers faced particular concern because their bodies might not yet be fully developed. Pelvic growth continued into late adolescence, increasing the likelihood of obstructed labor among girls who conceived early. Medieval communities did not possess statistical studies proving this relationship, but practical experience often encouraged caution regarding very young brides. At the opposite end of reproductive life, women who conceived after many previous pregnancies also attracted attention. Repeated childbirth gradually taxed the body. Iron stores diminished. Pelvic tissues weakened. Recovery required time that daily life rarely permitted. Many mothers therefore entered later pregnancies carrying invisible effects from earlier ones. One especially revealing feature of medieval advice literature concerns exercise. Contrary to stereotypes portraying medieval medicine as entirely passive, physicians frequently discussed appropriate levels of physical activity. Excessive exertion was discouraged for pregnant women, but complete inactivity was not generally recommended either. Moderate movement was often considered beneficial. Again, the practical challenge lay in translating ideal advice into ordinary life. A wealthy merchant's wife might reduce strenuous activity. A farmer's wife during harvest seldom had that luxury. As pregnancy progressed, women also prepared materially for the child's arrival. Swaddling cloths required sewing or repairing. Tiny garments had to be made if resources allowed. Cradles might be borrowed from relatives, handed down through generations, or built by local craftsmen. Families gathered whatever linen they could spare for both mother and infant. These preparations served practical purposes, but they also offered emotional reassurance. Creating clothing for an unborn child expressed hope. Every stitch seemed quietly assumed that someone would soon wear it. Yet hope always coexisted with uncertainty. Many families delayed certain celebrations until after safe delivery precisely because experience had taught them caution. The emotional landscape of pregnancy therefore differed subtly from modern expectations. Joy rarely existed without awareness of risk. Optimism remained tempered by memory. Nearly every extended family contained stories of sisters, daughters, cousins, or neighbors who had not survived childbirth. These memories shaped behavior across generations. Grandmothers advised daughters. Older sisters guided younger ones. Experienced mothers quietly corrected first-time mothers. Knowledge moved through kitchens, spinning rooms, gardens, and village paths long before it appeared in written medical texts. This informal female network represented one of medieval Europe's greatest repositories of practical health knowledge. It also explains why childbirth remained primarily within women's hands for so many centuries. Men certainly contributed medical theories, legal structures, and religious guidance, but the accumulated experience of thousands upon thousands of births belonged overwhelmingly to women who had lived through them. In many respects, the birthing chamber became one of the few places where female expertise carried unquestioned authority. A respected midwife might confidently instruct noblewomen decades older than herself. Female relatives accepted her judgment. Even learned physicians entering the room often encountered practical knowledge they themselves lacked. That authority, however, brought immense responsibility. Every successful birth strengthened a midwife's reputation. Every tragedy tested it. Because medieval communities were comparatively small, reputations traveled quickly. A woman known for calm judgment during difficult deliveries might be summoned across neighboring villages despite long distances. Another associated with repeated poor outcomes could gradually lose the community's confidence, even when those outcomes resulted from circumstances beyond anyone's control. Payment alone never measured her standing. Trust did. That trust extended beyond childbirth itself. Midwives frequently advised new mothers regarding nursing, infant bathing, swaddling, sleeping arrangements, and early childhood care. They observed newborns for signs of weakness or unusual development. They reassured anxious parents when ordinary variations appeared alarming. They also recognized, through painful experience, when an infant seemed unlikely to survive. Neonatal care remained extraordinarily fragile. A child born prematurely faced daunting odds. Breathing difficulties, inability to feed effectively, congenital abnormalities, infection, or simple low birth weight all threatened survival during the first weeks. Families responded with remarkable attentiveness. Newborns were carefully wrapped to conserve warmth. They were fed frequently whenever possible. Relatives watched breathing during sleep. Baptism occurred promptly if health seemed uncertain. Every small improvement inspired cautious optimism. Every setback revived familiar fears. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to imagine medieval parents growing emotionally detached because infant mortality remained so high. The historical evidence suggests almost the opposite. Letters, saints' lives, household accounts, memorial inscriptions, and personal chronicles repeatedly reveal profound affection for children. Parents grieved deeply. Mothers mourned. Fathers commissioned prayers. Families remembered birthdays, feast days, and anniversaries. High mortality did not diminish love. If anything, it intensified appreciation for each surviving child. This emotional reality also shaped attitudes toward future pregnancies. Women who had experienced miscarriage or stillbirth often entered subsequent pregnancies carrying understandable anxiety. Families who had buried infants prepared differently than first-time parents untouched by loss. Their hope remained genuine, but experience had taught caution. By now, another important truth begins to emerge. When modern people ask why medieval childbirth was so dangerous, the answer cannot be reduced to one missing invention or one medical misunderstanding. Danger accumulated layer upon layer. Nutrition influenced health. Health influenced pregnancy. Pregnancy influenced labor. Labor influenced recovery. Recovery influenced the survival of both mother and child. Around each biological process stood a web of work, weather, wealth, belief, community, and circumstance. No single improvement could untangle the entire web. And perhaps nowhere does that interconnectedness become clearer than when we leave the household itself and examine the broader institutions surrounding birth: church courts, civic authorities, medical guilds, monasteries, charitable hospitals, and the growing body of written knowledge that gradually sought to bring greater order to one of humanity's oldest and most unpredictable experiences. It is within those institutions that medieval society's understanding of childbirth would continue to evolve, revealing how communities attempted, generation after generation, to make one of life's greatest dangers just a little less uncertain than it had been before. It is within those institutions that medieval society's understanding of childbirth would continue to evolve, revealing how communities attempted, generation after generation, to make one of life's greatest dangers just a little less uncertain than it had been before. The medieval world did not possess a single, unified medical system. Instead, care emerged from overlapping layers of authority. A village relied primarily upon its midwife and the practical wisdom of local women. A growing town might also include barber surgeons, apothecaries, physicians educated at universities, charitable hospitals, and clergy who provided spiritual guidance. Above all of these stood customs that had been accepted for generations, shaping decisions long before anyone consciously questioned them. For modern observers, this mixture can appear confusing. We often separate medicine, religion, law, and family into distinct institutions. Medieval society rarely did. A difficult pregnancy might involve advice from experienced mothers, prayers prescribed by a priest, herbal preparations from a local healer, recommendations drawn from classical medical texts, and legal concerns about inheritance, all within the same household. Rather than competing with one another, these different forms of knowledge usually existed side by side. Hospitals themselves also deserve careful reconsideration. When people hear the word hospital, they often imagine a modern medical center filled with physicians, surgical wards, and sophisticated equipment. Medieval hospitals served a much broader purpose. Many functioned primarily as places of hospitality, charity, shelter, and religious care. They received travelers, the elderly, the poor, the sick, and sometimes pregnant women, particularly those without family support. Medical treatment certainly occurred, but nursing, feeding, prayer, cleanliness, and comfort were often considered equally important parts of healing. This emphasis reflected the realities of the age. When medicine possessed relatively few powerful interventions, careful nursing could make an enormous difference. Keeping someone warm, nourished, hydrated, and clean may sound modest today, but these basic forms of care often determined whether weakened bodies recovered or declined further. Religious communities, particularly monasteries and convents, preserved significant amounts of medical knowledge. Monastic libraries copied ancient texts that might otherwise have disappeared. Monks cultivated herb gardens, prepared medicinal compounds, and recorded observations about illness. Convents likewise became important centers of practical healthcare for women, especially where experienced religious sisters combined literacy with years of caregiving. Not every monastery functioned as a medical center, of course, yet together these institutions helped preserve and transmit knowledge across generations during periods when written manuscripts remained rare and expensive. Herbal medicine occupied an especially important place within this tradition. Many plants recommended in medieval childbirth manuals were chosen according to humoral theories that modern science no longer accepts. Others, however, contained compounds that genuinely affected the body, even if medieval practitioners could not identify their active ingredients. Raspberry leaf, fennel, mint, sage, chamomile, pennyroyal, mugwort, and numerous other herbs appear throughout medieval medical collections. Although their purposes varied considerably, some were believed to strengthen pregnancy, others encouraged labor, some attempted to reduce pain, ease digestion, stimulate milk production, or assist recovery after birth. Modern medicine evaluates these plants very differently, and several can be dangerous, particularly during pregnancy. Yet their widespread use reminds us that medieval people continually searched for practical ways to improve outcomes rather than accepting suffering without question. Apothecaries gradually became increasingly important in larger towns. Unlike physicians who diagnosed illness, apothecaries specialized in preparing medicinal substances. Shelves held dried herbs, minerals, oils, resins, spices imported through long-distance trade, and carefully measured compounds based upon written recipes. The growth of these shops reflected another quiet transformation taking place across medieval Europe. Knowledge itself was becoming more organized. Recipes that once existed only in memory increasingly appeared in manuscripts. Local practices became written traditions. Experience slowly accumulated across wider geographic regions. Although progress remained uneven, the circulation of books allowed ideas developed in one city to influence practitioners hundreds of miles away. The rise of universities contributed to this process as well. Institutions such as Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Montpellier, and later many others produced physicians trained within shared intellectual traditions. Students studied anatomy as it was then understood, physiology, pharmacology, logic, and the great medical authorities inherited from antiquity and the Islamic world. Yet even these learned physicians often acknowledged childbirth as an area where experienced midwives possessed indispensable practical knowledge. This balance between theory and experience is one of the more interesting features of medieval medicine. Books explained general principles. Births taught individual realities. Neither entirely replaced the other. Occasionally, however, tensions emerged. Some university-trained physicians viewed traditional female knowledge with skepticism, particularly when remedies relied heavily upon charms or practices lacking classical authority. At the same time, village midwives sometimes distrusted learned men who possessed impressive Latin vocabulary but comparatively little first-hand experience assisting labor. Neither side was entirely wrong. Theory without practice had obvious limits. Practice without broader anatomical understanding also faced limitations. The most successful care often emerged when different forms of knowledge complemented rather than dismissed one another. Meanwhile, civic governments gradually recognized that childbirth carried public importance. Several medieval cities introduced regulations governing who could serve as a midwife. Licensing varied greatly from place to place, but authorities increasingly wanted experienced women rather than complete novices attending deliveries. In some communities, midwives swore detailed oaths before beginning their work. These surviving oaths reveal concerns extending well beyond technical skill. They promised to maintain confidentiality regarding what they witnessed inside households. They pledged to treat poor women as faithfully as wealthy ones. They agreed not to conceal evidence in cases involving disputed inheritance or questions of legitimacy. They undertook responsibility for emergency baptism if an infant's life appeared dangerously short. Such promises remind us that the birthing chamber sometimes became a place where legal, social, and religious questions converged. Questions of legitimacy could prove enormously important. Inheritance depended upon establishing lawful descent. Noble titles, property rights, merchant fortunes, and even royal succession occasionally rested upon the successful birth of a single child. Because of this, witnesses sometimes attended noble births, not to interfere with labor itself, but to verify the identity of the infant after delivery. This practice appears unusual today, yet it reflected genuine political necessity. History contains numerous succession disputes fueled by rumors that babies had been secretly exchanged or falsely presented as legitimate heirs. Most such accusations were unfounded. Nevertheless, the possibility shaped ceremonial practices surrounding aristocratic childbirth. For ordinary villagers, concerns differed. A peasant family worried less about dynastic politics than about whether enough food remained for another mouth through the coming winter. Every additional child represented both promise and responsibility. Young children consumed resources before eventually contributing labor. Families therefore balanced joy with practical calculation. Could another cow be purchased? Would enough grain be harvested? Could older siblings help care for the baby while parents worked? These were not cold economic calculations divorced from affection. Rather, they reflected the realities of survival within subsistence agriculture. Love and practicality coexisted because they had to. Children themselves gradually became contributors to household work long before reaching adulthood. By 6 or 7 years old, many performed simple tasks suitable for their strength. They fetched water, collected eggs, watched younger siblings, gathered kindling, or frightened birds away from crops. As they matured, responsibilities expanded. This helps explain why successful childbirth mattered so profoundly to medieval economies. Each surviving infant represented not only another family member but another future participant in the household's labor. Conversely, every maternal death removed someone whose knowledge, skills, and daily work could not easily be replaced. Widowers often remarried relatively quickly following maternal mortality. Modern readers sometimes interpret this as emotional detachment. The historical reality was usually more complicated. An infant required nursing. Young children required supervision. Fields required management. Households depended upon continuous labor. Remarriage frequently reflected necessity rather than an absence of grief. Likewise, widows with surviving children sometimes remarried for similar practical reasons. Marriage in medieval society certainly involved affection for many couples, but it also functioned as an economic partnership essential for maintaining households. This broader context again reveals how childbirth stood at the intersection of personal emotion and social structure. One loss affected many lives simultaneously. Another area where medieval understanding slowly evolved concerned anatomy itself. Human dissection remained uncommon for much of the Middle Ages compared with later centuries, although it was not entirely absent as popular myths sometimes suggest. By the late medieval period, certain universities began incorporating anatomical demonstrations into medical education under carefully controlled circumstances. These observations gradually corrected some older assumptions inherited from antiquity. Progress, however, remained slow. Direct knowledge of the uterus, placenta, fetal position, and pelvic anatomy developed only gradually because opportunities for systematic study remained limited. Consequently, much obstetrical knowledge continued to rely upon observation during living births rather than anatomical investigation afterward. Even so, illustrated medical manuscripts occasionally attempted to depict fetal positions inside the womb. Some images appear surprisingly thoughtful. Others look strange to modern eyes. Yet each represents another attempt to visualize processes hidden within the body. They remind us that curiosity about reproduction never disappeared. People desperately wanted better answers. One especially revealing aspect of medieval pregnancy involved cravings. Many texts mention unusual desires for specific foods among pregnant women. These cravings were interpreted through humoral theory, bodily imbalance, or changes occurring during fetal development. Family members often tried to satisfy them when possible, believing unmet cravings might somehow affect either mother or child. Modern medicine recognizes that pregnancy can indeed alter appetite and taste, although not for the reasons medieval physicians imagined. Here again we encounter a recurring historical pattern. The observation proved genuine. The explanation differed. Such examples caution us against dismissing medieval medicine too quickly. Its practitioners frequently noticed real biological phenomena. Their challenge lay in constructing accurate explanations with limited scientific tools. The months following childbirth also attracted growing attention from both medical and religious writers. Recovery was increasingly understood as a process rather than a single moment. Women were encouraged, when circumstances permitted, to rest, eat nourishing foods, avoid excessive strain, and gradually resume ordinary duties. The phrase, "when circumstances permitted," remains important. For poorer families, necessity often overruled ideal advice. A woman might return to household tasks far sooner than her body had fully healed. Heavy lifting, repeated bending, carrying water, or prolonged standing all resumed because there was no one else available. The long-term consequences of this repeated strain rarely appear explicitly in surviving records. Yet modern medicine suggests they likely contributed to chronic pain, pelvic injuries, and other conditions that many women silently carried for years. Historical documents rarely preserve these everyday discomforts. They more readily record deaths than lifelong suffering. This creates an important imbalance in our evidence. The greatest danger of medieval childbirth was certainly mortality. But many women survived carrying injuries that permanently altered their lives. These quieter consequences rarely entered chronicles written by kings, bishops, or government officials. Instead, they linger beneath the surface of history, visible only when scattered medical texts, household advice, legal disputes, and archaeological evidence are carefully assembled. Perhaps this is one of the most valuable lessons the subject offers. The past was not divided simply between survival and death. There existed an enormous middle ground occupied by people who lived on while carrying physical consequences that history seldom recorded. As written medical knowledge continued expanding during the later Middle Ages, authors increasingly attempted to gather practical advice into comprehensive manuals. Some addressed physicians, others targeted educated households. Still others preserved remedies circulating among experienced practitioners. Together these works formed an evolving conversation about pregnancy and childbirth. A conversation that crossed generations, languages, monasteries, universities, villages, and royal courts. It is within those manuscripts, copied patiently by hand and carried across medieval Europe, that we begin to hear not only the voices of scholars but also faint echoes of countless midwives whose practical experience slowly found its way onto parchment, ensuring that the knowledge gained in one difficult birth might quietly guide another, many years and many miles away. It is within those manuscripts, copied patiently by hand and carried across medieval Europe, that we begin to hear not only the voices of scholars but also faint echoes of countless midwives whose practical experience slowly found its way onto parchment, ensuring that the knowledge gained in one difficult birth might quietly guide another, many years and many miles away. Those manuscripts also reveal something else that is easy to overlook. Medieval childbirth was never understood as a single dramatic event lasting only a few hours. Instead, it was treated as part of a much longer cycle that began before conception, continued throughout pregnancy, reached its most dangerous point during labor, and then extended into the vulnerable weeks that followed. The mother did not simply survive the birth and return immediately to ordinary life. She entered another uncertain stage in which recovery remained fragile. The infant required constant attention, and both lives could still change course with surprising speed. Because of this, medieval households prepared for childbirth long before the first contraction appeared. Preparation began with ordinary objects. Extra linen might be washed and stored if enough cloth was available. Firewood was gathered to ensure warmth. Water buckets were filled in advance. Simple foods that could be eaten quickly were prepared. Herbs thought useful during labor were dried or kept nearby. Neighbors who had previously offered assistance knew they might soon be called. For poorer families, even these modest preparations represented careful planning. Linen was expensive. Fuel required labor. Water required carrying. Every item assembled before labor reduced one burden once childbirth began. In wealthier households, the preparations became more elaborate. Noble women often entered a period historians sometimes describe as lying in, withdrawing from many public responsibilities during the final weeks of pregnancy. Chambers were furnished with rich curtains that reduced drafts and softened light. Religious images might be placed prominently within the room. Candles were stocked. Comfortable cushions, warmed bedding, and additional attendants stood ready. Although such surroundings appear luxurious compared with peasant homes, they served practical purposes alongside displays of status. Warmth mattered. Rest mattered. Privacy mattered. Yet despite these differences in comfort, the biological uncertainties remained remarkably similar. A queen could hemorrhage just as unexpectedly as a farmer's wife. An aristocratic infant could arrive in breech position no less than a miller's child. Wealth improved many conditions around childbirth, but it could not fully control what occurred within the body itself. This reality repeatedly surprised medieval chroniclers. Royal births occupy a prominent place in historical records precisely because they affected kingdoms. Chroniclers described the anxious waiting surrounding the birth of heirs, the celebrations that followed successful deliveries, and the mourning that accompanied maternal or infant deaths. Reading these accounts alongside village records reveals an unexpected equality. Status influenced ceremony. It did not abolish vulnerability. In fact, political importance sometimes increased emotional pressure. A noblewoman carrying the expected heir to a great estate understood that many futures rested upon her pregnancy. Servants waited. Advisors watched. Relatives prayed. Entire alliances could depend upon one healthy infant surviving delivery. Imagine the silence that might settle over a castle after labor had continued through an entire night. Outside the chamber, courtyards remained unusually quiet. Fires burned low in great halls where no feast had yet begun. Messengers waited without instructions because there was still no news to carry. Every hour stretched longer than the last. Inside, however, the scene looked remarkably similar to thousands of ordinary homes. Women adjusted pillows. Water was reheated. Hands were held. Encouraging words were repeated. The midwife listened carefully. Time passed one contraction at a time. That contrast between enormous political consequence and profoundly ordinary human experience gives medieval childbirth much of its emotional depth. History often remembers the kingdom that gained or lost an heir. It rarely pauses inside the room where exhausted women simply hoped to survive until morning. The newborn's first moments also carried significance extending far beyond the obvious joy of birth. A healthy cry brought immediate relief because breathing represented the first great uncertainty. Midwives quickly examined the infant for obvious abnormalities, ensured airways remained clear as they understood the process, tied and cut the umbilical cord, and wrapped the child to preserve warmth. Swaddling deserves closer attention because it has become one of the most recognizable images of medieval infancy. Modern viewers sometimes assume tightly wrapped babies reflected superstition alone. The truth is more balanced. Swaddling was believed to help support straight limb growth, provide warmth, and calm newborns by limiting uncontrolled movements. While medieval explanations differed from modern pediatric science, researchers today recognize that appropriately performed swaddling can indeed soothe some infants, although it also requires careful attention to hip development and safe sleeping practices. Here again, a familiar pattern appears. Observation sometimes pointed toward useful practices even when the accompanying explanations proved inaccurate. Once the immediate work of delivery ended, attention shifted rapidly toward feeding. The first successful breastfeeding often represented another moment of profound relief. A newborn able to latch and nurse strongly inspired optimism. Difficulties, however, generated immediate concern. Weak sucking, persistent sleepiness, breathing problems, or inability to swallow all suggested potential danger. No laboratory tests existed. No neonatal intensive care units waited nearby. Families relied upon close observation. The experienced eyes of older women became their diagnostic instruments. One grandmother might notice that the infant's color seemed wrong. Another recognized unusually shallow breathing. The midwife compared the child's behavior with countless newborns she had previously delivered. This accumulated practical memory became extraordinarily valuable. It also reminds us that medieval medicine relied heavily upon community observation rather than specialized technology. The mother's condition remained equally important. Contrary to some popular portrayals, childbirth did not instantly end when the baby emerged. Delivery of the placenta remained an essential stage. If retained, serious complications could follow. Midwives watched carefully for signs that this final part of labor proceeded normally. Only then could genuine relief begin to spread through the room. Even afterward, however, nobody assumed the danger had completely passed. Heavy bleeding remained possible. Fever could develop later. Exhaustion itself sometimes became overwhelming after prolonged labor. This prolonged uncertainty shaped family behavior in subtle ways. Celebrations often remained restrained for a day or two. Neighbors congratulated quietly. Relatives continued checking on the household. Visitors sometimes limited their stay to avoid tiring the mother. Although joyful occasions certainly occurred, experience encouraged patience before declaring complete success. The first nights after birth were particularly demanding. Newborns rarely followed predictable schedules. Feeding occurred repeatedly throughout darkness. The mother's sleep became fragmented almost immediately. Household members took turns assisting whenever possible. Older daughters frequently helped care for younger siblings while mothers recovered. These small domestic routines rarely appear in grand historical narratives, yet they formed the everyday fabric of medieval family life. Without them, survival became far more difficult. One fascinating aspect of surviving household advice concerns cleanliness. Popular imagination often portrays medieval Europe as completely indifferent to hygiene. The historical evidence paints a more complicated picture. People certainly lacked modern understanding of microbes. They did not sterilize instruments in contemporary ways. Yet they clearly appreciated that fresh linen, washing, warm water, and orderly surroundings contributed to health and comfort. Medical texts frequently recommend bathing under certain circumstances, laundering cloth, airing bedding, and maintaining relatively clean living spaces whenever practical. The obstacle was usually material rather than intellectual. Heating enough water required enormous effort. Soap remained valuable. Clean linen wore out through repeated washing. Crowded housing limited possibilities. Recognizing the value of cleanliness proved much easier than achieving it consistently. This distinction becomes especially important when discussing postpartum infection. The absence of germ theory did not mean medieval people welcomed dirt. Rather, they lacked knowledge of invisible contamination while simultaneously living within practical limitations that made ideal hygiene difficult. Interestingly, one advantage occasionally existed in comparison with much later periods. Because childbirth generally remained under the care of one household midwife rather than physicians moving rapidly between multiple deliveries without washing their hands, some forms of cross-contamination that became tragically common in 18th and 19th century lying in hospitals were less frequent in isolated home births. This should not be misunderstood. Home childbirth remained extremely dangerous, but history sometimes refuses simple stories of steady progress. Certain institutional changes temporarily created new risks before scientific understanding finally caught up. The medieval household therefore occupied a complex position. It lacked modern surgery, antibiotics, and blood transfusions. Yet it also avoided some later hazards associated with crowded maternity wards before antiseptic practice became standard. Such contradictions remind us why historical comparison requires careful nuance. Another overlooked aspect concerns the role of fathers during the hours immediately after birth. Although many men remained outside the chamber throughout labor itself, they entered family life again almost immediately afterward. A successful birth transformed not only the mother into a parent, but also the husband into a father with fresh responsibilities. He might carry news to relatives, arrange baptism, organize Thanksgiving offerings, manage household finances while his wife recovered, supervise agricultural work temporarily neglected during labor. His practical duties multiplied quickly. Emotionally, surviving letters and chronicles suggest enormous relief. The arrival of a healthy child after anxious waiting often produced gratitude expressed through donations to churches, charitable gifts, or special prayers. These responses reflected sincere religious belief, but they also acknowledged how narrowly disaster had sometimes been avoided. The emotional intensity of relief can only be understood alongside the genuine expectation that tragedy remained possible. Many families had experienced it before. Others had witnessed neighbors endure it. No one entered childbirth imagining only the happiest outcome. Perhaps this explains why medieval celebrations often carried a quiet seriousness beneath their joy. Life had been preserved. Nothing about that felt routine. The Church likewise marked childbirth through several rituals extending beyond baptism alone. Following recovery, many women participated in the ceremony commonly called churching. Modern readers occasionally misunderstand this practice as punishment or purification after an allegedly impure event. The historical picture is more varied. Certainly, ideas about ritual purity influenced some interpretations. Yet many women also experience churching as thanksgiving for survival, public reintegration into community life, and recognition that one dangerous passage had safely ended. The ceremony's meaning likely differed across regions, periods, and individual experience. Like much of medieval religion, it combined theological symbolism with ordinary human emotion. Stepping back into church after weeks of recovery publicly acknowledged that mother and child had crossed one of life's most uncertain thresholds together. Yet for every family walking gratefully toward that ceremony, another household faced a different reality. Some mothers never regained sufficient strength. Others survived while mourning infants who had lived only briefly. Occasionally, entire families found themselves reorganizing daily life around unexpected loss. Communities responded with practical compassion whenever they could. Neighbors prepared food. Relatives cared for surviving children. Parish priests offered comfort through familiar prayers and funeral rites. Village life depended upon mutual support precisely because everyone understood how easily fortune could change. This shared awareness created strong networks of obligation. Today's grieving family had likely helped another household years before. Tomorrow they might need assistance themselves. Such reciprocal support formed an essential part of medieval resilience. It also softened, though never erased, the immense risks surrounding childbirth. As the centuries progressed, small improvements accumulated almost unnoticed. Better manuscript circulation gradually spread successful techniques. Trade introduced new medicinal ingredients. Urban governments refined licensing practices for midwives. Universities debated anatomy with increasing sophistication. None of these developments transformed childbirth overnight. No dramatic breakthrough suddenly made medieval birth safe. Instead, knowledge advanced slowly, often by preserving countless small observations gathered from ordinary women whose names history has forgotten. Each successful delivery added another quiet lesson. Each difficult labor prompted another question. Each copied manuscript carried another fragment of practical experience into a different village or city. The process resembled the growth of a tree more than the explosion of a fire. Slow, uneven, patient, and always incomplete. It is precisely within that slow accumulation of knowledge that another important chapter begins to unfold. As late medieval Europe entered periods of profound social change that would reshape medicine, education, religion, and family life together. Changes that would eventually alter not only how childbirth was understood, but also who possessed the authority to guide mothers through one of the oldest and most dangerous moments of human existence. It is precisely within that slow accumulation of knowledge that another important chapter begins to unfold. As late medieval Europe entered periods of profound social change that would reshape medicine, education, religion, and family life together. Changes that would eventually alter not only how childbirth was understood, but also who possessed the authority to guide mothers through one of the oldest and most dangerous moments of human existence. One of the quiet forces behind these changes was not a single invention or remarkable individual, but the gradual growth of literacy among those responsible for preserving medical knowledge. Throughout much of the early Middle Ages, practical experience remained overwhelmingly local. A midwife in northern France rarely had an opportunity to compare her methods with one working in northern Italy or the kingdoms of Iberia. Customs evolved within villages and regions, shaped by climate, available plants, local traditions, and generations of observation. As manuscripts became more widely copied and circulated, those separate worlds slowly began to overlap. Medical texts traveled with merchants, scholars, clerics, and students. A physician educated in one city might later practice hundreds of miles away, carrying with him ideas gathered from teachers who themselves had drawn upon Greek, Roman, Arabic, and local European traditions. Even when literacy remained uncommon among village midwives, educated practitioners increasingly wrote down observations that reflected practical childbirth experience. Progress unfolded almost invisibly. No medieval family would have noticed dramatic improvements from one generation to the next. Yet, over centuries, small observations accumulated. Certain herbs proved more consistently useful than others. Particular labor positions appeared repeatedly in successful deliveries. Advice concerning diet gradually became more refined. Descriptions of fetal presentation grew more detailed. These modest improvements illustrate one of history's recurring patterns. Human knowledge rarely advances only through spectacular discoveries. More often, it grows because thousands of ordinary people quietly preserve lessons learned through experience. At the same time, Europe itself was changing. Towns expanded. Trade routes became busier. Markets attracted people from wider regions. With larger populations came both opportunities and new dangers. Urban life offered access to physicians, apothecaries, surgeons, and charitable institutions unavailable in many rural communities. Yet crowded neighborhoods also encouraged the spread of infectious disease. Narrow streets, shared wells, livestock living close to human dwellings, and limited waste disposal created environments where illness circulated with unsettling efficiency. Pregnant women carried these risks with them every day. A simple fever that modern medicine might treat with antibiotics could become life-threatening. Contaminated food or water posed dangers not only to the mother but also to the developing child. Respiratory illnesses moved rapidly through crowded households where several generations often shared the same building. Again, the danger surrounding childbirth extended far beyond the delivery itself. The body arriving in labor reflected months of accumulated circumstances. Climate also shaped maternal health in ways modern listeners sometimes overlook. A harsh winter affected pregnancy differently than a prosperous summer. Cold weather increased demands for firewood and preserved food. Travel became more difficult. Fresh vegetables disappeared from many diets. Livestock sometimes perished before spring. Pregnant women entered labor carrying the consequences of entire seasons. Conversely, years of abundant harvests generally produced healthier mothers and heavier newborns, although prosperity never guaranteed an uncomplicated birth. Weather therefore influenced childbirth indirectly, through nutrition, disease, workload, and household stability. Medieval people understood this connection instinctively. They simply described it differently. A failed harvest did not merely mean less bread. It meant weaker bodies months later. Another important transformation involved the increasing specialization of occupations. Earlier medieval communities often relied upon individuals performing many overlapping roles. By the later Middle Ages, larger towns supported more distinct professions. Apothecaries concentrated upon preparing medicines. Barber surgeons developed particular procedural skills. Physicians focused increasingly upon diagnosis and learned medicine. Midwives remained specialists in childbirth itself. This specialization created both cooperation and occasional rivalry. Each profession defended its own expertise. Yet childbirth stubbornly resisted becoming the exclusive territory of any single group. The laboring woman still required continuous personal attention more than abstract theory. This reality preserved the importance of experienced midwives even as universities expanded. One remarkable aspect of medieval childbirth is how little of its essential emotional experience changed despite these broader social transformations. Whether a woman gave birth in the 11th century or the 15th, she still confronted uncertainty. She still depended upon those immediately around her. She still entered labor unable to predict exactly how events would unfold. history altered many surrounding conditions. The emotional threshold remained strikingly familiar. Perhaps this explains why so many medieval prayers concerning childbirth feel unexpectedly timeless. Although written in languages and theological frameworks distant from modern readers, they repeatedly ask for remarkably similar things: strength, protection, safe delivery, health for mother and child, courage during pain, hope beyond fear. These requests transcend particular centuries because they arise from experiences that remain profoundly human. The physical environment of medieval homes also deserves closer examination. Most ordinary houses admitted relatively little natural light. Windows were small because glass remained expensive and heat difficult to retain. Smoke from indoor hearths often lingered despite roof openings. Walls might be constructed from timber, stone, or wattle and daub depending upon region and wealth. Floors were sometimes packed earth, sometimes wooden planks. Furniture remained limited by modern standards. Within such surroundings, creating an appropriate birthing chamber required thoughtful rearrangement. Beds became central working spaces. Extra blankets appeared. Water vessels stood nearby. Candles illuminated the room if labor continued after sunset. Family members moved furniture aside to provide attendants greater freedom of movement. These preparations remind us that childbirth temporarily transformed the household itself. Ordinary domestic space became a place of concentrated attention. For several hours or occasionally several days, the rhythm of the entire home revolved around one room. Meals were prepared around it. Children were kept quieter than usual. Visitors arrived cautiously. Neighbors waited for news. The household became suspended between anticipation and uncertainty. Sound played an unexpectedly important role within this environment. Without modern machines, electronic monitors, or artificial lighting, people listened carefully. The midwife listened to breathing. Relatives listened for changes in the mother's voice. Those waiting outside listened for the first cry of the newborn. Even silence carried meaning. An unusually quiet room after many hours could increase anxiety among those waiting beyond the door. Likewise, familiar domestic sounds continued around childbirth despite its seriousness. Wood crackled in the hearth. Rain struck the roof. Animals shifted in nearby barns. Church bells marked passing hours. Somewhere outside, ordinary life continued while one family experienced one of its most important moments. This contrast between ordinary surroundings and extraordinary emotional significance gives medieval childbirth much of its quiet power. The world did not stop. The village continued. Markets opened. Fields required work. Yet within one small room, the future of an entire family balanced delicately upon circumstances nobody could fully control. Another frequently misunderstood subject concerns pain itself. Modern medicine rightly emphasizes reducing suffering whenever safely possible. Medieval people certainly wished the same. What differed was their understanding of why pain occurred and what could realistically lessen it. Christian theology associated childbirth pain with the story of Eve in the book of Genesis, but theological explanation did not eliminate compassion. In fact, sermons and devotional writings often encouraged communities to support laboring women through prayer, practical assistance, and kindness. Pain possessed spiritual meaning for many believers, yet relieving suffering whenever possible remained an act of mercy. This distinction matters because later stereotypes sometimes portray medieval Christianity as encouraging unnecessary suffering. The historical evidence is considerably more nuanced. The inability to remove pain did not imply approval of it. Rather, medieval society lacked reliable methods for accomplishing what modern anesthetic medicine eventually achieved. Some herbal preparations likely produced mild sedative effects. Wine occasionally helped reduce anxiety. Warm compresses soothed aching muscles. Massage eased exhaustion. Steady reassurance reduced fear. None of these approaches approached the effectiveness of modern epidural anesthesia. Yet they reflected sincere efforts to ease an experience everyone recognized as extraordinarily difficult. The relationship between childbirth and death also shaped medieval attitudes toward memory. Many women prepared spiritually before labor because they understood the possibility of not surviving. Confession, prayer, and reconciliation with family members often occurred during late pregnancy, particularly if previous deliveries had been difficult. This preparation should not be mistaken for despair. Instead, it reflected a society accustomed to acknowledging mortality openly. Modern people frequently postpone conversations about death until absolutely necessary. Medieval families more often accepted its possibility as an ordinary companion to important moments in life. Curiously, this awareness sometimes appears to have deepened appreciation for survival rather than diminishing hope. The arrival of a healthy child after a dangerous labor inspired gratitude precisely because everyone understood what might have happened instead. Another area where historians have revised older assumptions concerns emotional attachment between mothers and infants. Earlier generations of scholarship occasionally suggested that high infant mortality discouraged strong parental bonds. Recent evidence paints a very different picture. Personal letters, devotional writings, household accounts, memorial inscriptions, and archaeological findings all suggest deep affection existed despite uncertainty. Parents named children carefully. They mourned intensely. They commissioned memorial prayers. They treasured tiny possessions associated with deceased infants. Love did not wait until survival seemed guaranteed. It began almost immediately. This emotional reality makes medieval childbirth even more poignant. Families knowingly invested their hearts despite understanding the risks. Every pregnancy, therefore, involved remarkable optimism. Hope repeatedly overcame memory. Otherwise, communities could not have endured. The practical wisdom passed between women also contained surprisingly sophisticated observations about recovery. Older mothers frequently emphasized gradual movement after birth rather than immediate heavy labor whenever circumstances permitted. Nutritious broths appeared repeatedly in household advice. Warmth remained important. Rest, though often limited by necessity, was encouraged whenever assistance from relatives made it possible. These recommendations reveal careful observation accumulated across generations. Although medieval physiology explained healing differently from modern medicine, experienced women recognized many patterns that continue to make practical sense today. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in discussions of exhaustion. Long before concepts such as postpartum recovery entered medical vocabulary, medieval households understood that childbirth consumed enormous physical strength. The body required time. Whether society always allowed sufficient time was another matter entirely. Economic reality frequently intervened. Fields could not remain untended indefinitely. Animals required feeding regardless of maternal fatigue. Children still needed supervision. The ideal recovery described in advice literature often collided with practical necessity. That tension between medical ideals and ordinary life has existed throughout history. It did not begin in the medieval period, nor has it entirely disappeared. By the 15th century, Europe stood on the threshold of transformations that would eventually reshape medicine far beyond what anyone living then could imagine. Printing would accelerate the spread of knowledge. Anatomical investigation would become increasingly systematic. Exploration would introduce new medicinal plants from distant continents. Scientific methods would slowly challenge inherited authorities. Yet those changes still belonged largely to the future. For the women living through the later Middle Ages, childbirth remained an intensely personal encounter with uncertainty, one guided above all by experienced hands, familiar voices, inherited wisdom, and the fragile hope that each contraction carried them one step closer to seeing the child they had waited months to meet. And it is from within that familiar world, poised between ancient traditions and the first quiet signs of profound medical change, that we can begin to follow how childbirth itself would become one of the earliest areas in which inherited experience, written learning, and careful observation gradually started to reshape one another in ways that neither medieval midwives nor university physicians could yet fully foresee. And it is from within that familiar world, poised between ancient traditions and the first quiet signs of profound medical change, that we can begin to follow how childbirth itself would become one of the earliest areas in which inherited experience, written learning, and careful observation gradually started to reshape one another in ways that neither medieval midwives nor university physicians could yet fully foresee. Yet, before those changes gathered real momentum, it is worth lingering a little longer inside the ordinary medieval household, because this is where childbirth was actually experienced. Historical change often arrives so gradually that the people living through it barely notice. A manuscript copied in a monastery might eventually influence a physician 100 miles away, but for the woman beginning labor in a small timber-framed cottage, the faces surrounding her remained much the same as they had for generations. Her mother might be there, perhaps an older sister, a trusted neighbor who had delivered 6 or 7 children herself. The village midwife, maybe a grandmother whose own childbearing years were long behind her but whose memory remained sharp. Together these women represented something difficult to measure but enormously valuable: accumulated lived experience. Each had seen births unfold differently. Some had witnessed remarkably easy deliveries lasting only a few hours. Others remembered babies arriving after 2 exhausting days. Some had seen mothers recover quickly. Others carried painful memories of women whose strength slowly faded despite everyone's efforts. This collective memory shaped every decision made inside the room. Unlike modern medical records, which preserve written details for future review, medieval knowledge often existed inside people's memories. A particularly unusual birth might be discussed for decades afterward. Young women heard those stories while growing up. They learned which signs worried experienced mothers and which apparently frightening events often resolved safely. Story itself became a form of education. That oral tradition deserves recognition alongside written medicine because, for much of medieval Europe, it reached far more people than books ever could. The same pattern appeared in pregnancy customs. An expectant mother rarely navigated those months alone. Older women noticed changes before she sometimes did herself. They commented on swelling in her feet, changes in appetite, the baby's movements, or the way she carried her pregnancy. Advice flowed almost constantly, sometimes welcome, sometimes overwhelming. Eat a little more of this. Avoid too much of that. Walk while you still comfortably can. Rest this afternoon. Keep warm after sunset. These recommendations varied enormously from one region to another, but together they created an environment in which pregnancy belonged not only to one woman but to an entire female community. As our journey through medieval childbirth comes to an end, perhaps the greatest surprise is not simply how dangerous it was, but how much of that danger existed beyond any one person's control. The women who entered the birthing chamber were not reckless. The midwives who guided them were not ignorant. The physicians who studied ancient texts were not uninterested in discovery. They were all working at the edge of the knowledge available to them, trying to solve one of humanity's oldest and most difficult challenges with the tools their own age could provide. Looking back from the 21st century, it is easy to focus on what they lacked. It is harder, but perhaps more rewarding, to recognize what they possessed. They possessed experience carefully passed from one generation to the next. They possessed communities that understood the importance of standing beside families in moments of fear. They possessed remarkable resilience in the face of uncertainty. And they possessed a determination to keep learning, even when progress arrived one small observation at a time. That quiet determination became part of the foundation upon which modern obstetrics would eventually be built. Every careful midwife who noticed a recurring pattern, every physician who questioned an inherited assumption, every family that preserved practical knowledge through conversation rather than books, each contributed, in some small way, to humanity's long effort to make childbirth safer. History is often remembered through kings, wars, revolutions, and empires. But civilizations are sustained by ordinary lives, by parents raising children, by neighbors helping one another, by caregivers whose names never entered the chronicles. Few experiences reveal that truth more clearly than childbirth. Behind every famous ruler stood a mother. Behind every scholar stood a family. Behind every generation stood countless women whose courage was rarely celebrated, even though the future depended upon it. If this documentary has accomplished anything, I hope it has made the medieval world feel a little less distant. As people worried about their families, they hoped for healthy children, they leaned on friends during difficult moments, they searched for better answers, and although their world was profoundly different from ours, their hopes often feel remarkably familiar. History has the power to remind us that the past was not populated by strangers, but by people who loved, feared, endured, and persevered in ways we can still recognize today. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of the most intimate and often misunderstood parts of medieval life. If there is another forgotten corner of history you'd like to drift into on a future evening, I'd love to explore it with you. Until then, may your night be peaceful, your curiosity remain endless, and your appreciation for the quiet stories of history continue to grow. Good night.